Today we're going to be speaking with filmmaker, recording artist and creative visionary Steve Taylor. Born in California and raised in a Christian home in Colorado, Steve's creative journey has been extraordinary. After studying music, filmmaking and acting at the University of Colorado, he launched a career that has inspired audiences for decades. As a recording artist, Steve earned 2 Grammy nominations and made history as one of the only artists to win twice a Billboard Music Awards for videos that he videoed himself. He also fronted an alternative rock band, Chagall Guevara. Steve's passion for storytelling carried into film, where he directed The Second Chance for Sony and Blue Like Jazz, based on Donald Miller's best-selling memoir, a film that premiered at the film festivals and won the Billboard Award for Best Feature Film. His latest project, Sketch, starring Emmy winner Tony Hale, premiered at the International Film Festival and has already captured the hearts around the world. The film tells the story of a young girl whose story comes to life, bringing both chaos and redemption as her family unites to face what they never meant to unleash. With 97% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, Sketch is hailed as one of the most standout family films of the year. Today, Steve serves as filmmaker in residence at Lipscomb University in Nashville, where he lives with his wife, the artist DL, and their daughter, continuing to create stories that bring hope, imagination, and faith to life. So to give us an insight into his real life, we're joined by filmmaker, recording artist, and creative visionary, Steve Taylor. Steve, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Cyrus. That was very kind. Thank you.
Bless you, Steve. Steve, can you give us an insight into your childhood? What was it like growing up, and when did this creativity first take part of your life?
Yes, I grew up in a Christian home. My dad is actually a pastor, and my mother was a teacher. And so I was just, part of a church family. My dad was a singer, and my mother was a pretty creative teacher. So I was around creative people. And when I went to college, I went to a pretty radical university, Colorado University in Boulder, Colorado. But I was also a youth pastor at the same time. And so I was really interested in how I could communicate my faith to a way that was, interesting to the generation that I was living in. And that's where I got into music and filmmaking, was while I was still in college.
You mentioned, obviously, you're brought up in a Christian home and your father was a Baptist minister as well. How would you explain your personal relationship with Jesus Christ as a youngster?
Yes, I became a Christian when I was pretty young. I understood the basics as I knew them. And then, when I got to be a teenager and it was time to rebel, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to rebel against, because my parents, even though they were fairly conservative, they were very consistent between what they said and the way they lived. And so that had a big influence on me. I realize not everybody has the idyllic childhood that I grew up with, but I was really fortunate to have 2 loving parents who were serious about their faith. My dad passed a couple of years ago, but my mother is still very much active as a Christian who's always, witnessing to family and people she meets and working at a soup kitchen and all the things. So she's still quite an inspiration at 92 years old.
Wow, amazing. How important was that to have that strong family foundation while you were a youngster growing up as well, and having such faith and belief in your family from a very young age?
Yeah, it's immeasurably important. My wife, who I've been married to for 40 years, did not have that. And it was kind of a shock to realize, oh yeah, not everybody gets what I experienced growing up. So it's helped me become much more understanding and of what other people go through, because my childhood was not particularly normal, I guess.
As a child, did you have any ambitions or dreams, or did you know what you wanted to be as a youngster?
Yeah, I don't know what was wrong with me, but I knew from a young age that I wanted to be involved in entertainment in some way. And a mentor of mine, encouraged those of us who were going to be performing to get in touch with our childlike vulnerabilities. And he said, and don't think you don't have them. If you were a well-rounded individual, you wouldn't feel the need to get on stage in the first place. So I think that's very true. For whatever reason, I like being in front of people. I like making things. I like presenting them to people. I love seeing their reaction. I'm not sure that it's a good thing, but it's what I got.
So give us an idea, how did you get into the entertainment industry, so to speak? Because you've already involved in so much. You've been involved in music and film and entertainment and everything else. So where did that journey really begin for you?
So growing up in church, I sang a lot, and we had different youth groups, and we had like some sketch comedy groups and things like that. When I got to college, I was a music major and a film minor, and also took acting classes. I was very influenced at the time by punk rock and new wave that was coming over from England. And I loved a lot of bands that were coming over, but they were very good at pointing out what was wrong with the world. They weren't very good at offering any hope. And I thought, well, as a Christian, I believe I know what ultimate truth is and the hope that we have in Jesus. How can I mix those two things? And so I wrote songs that were could be critical of hypocrisy within the church, and also of hypocrisy in the rest of the world. And they tended to use a lot of satire because that made the songs feel less preachy. And for whatever reason, it seemed to catch on with a larger audience. And so I got signed to a record label pretty early on after college, and ended up making a number of albums with my band. Started doing filmmaking by making music videos for myself and then for other artists, and then ultimately started producing other groups, predominantly Christian groups, one in particular that I thought should be heard by the rest of the world. And that band was called Sixpence None the Richer. And so I started a record label just to put their record out, and it had a song called Kiss Me that became a worldwide pop hit that still gets performed all the time today. It's hard to get away from. So that was a fun ride to see that happen.
I love the fact that you were a Christian, but you're a songwriter, and you wanted to be in the music industry, and you wanted to write kind of Christian songs, or songs that give hope, but reach it to the more secular audience. And I guess some Christians could have been saying, oh, you should have just stayed in the church and produced music for us. But you wanted to go out there to the bigger, wider world and give that message of hope, didn't you?
Yes, I got a lot of criticism for that very thing. But I mean, ultimately, it's good to sing to the choir. It's good to preach to the choir. The choir needs it too, but the rest of the world needs to hear the hope of Jesus as well. And as we're doing that, I think we've got to find ways that are can be sort of subversive. Like, just preaching doesn't always do it for people. Finding ways to communicate within our current culture calls for a lot of different methods.
Now, you have a song called Sin for a Season. Can you give our viewers an insight into what is this song about and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, Cyrus, that's a deep cut. Thank you for asking. It's just a song. It's got like 3 stories woven in a 4-minute kind of pop song, and it's just it's a callback from a biblical reference about I think it was Joseph who decided to stay true to God instead of enjoying the pleasures of sin for a season. And so it takes 3 contemporary stories and kind of weaves them together to tell that story.
I love that explanation. For anyone watching today and they feel, I'm not worthy for Jesus Christ, I've committed so many sins in my own life and Jesus Christ would never want me, what would you say to that person watching today?
Oh, man, you got to read the words of Jesus, because that's Jesus says, come to me all who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And Jesus is there to offer forgiveness and peace. And, as someone who's been a believer for many, many decades, I don't know how I would get through life without the knowledge that Jesus has accepted me and forgiven me ultimately.
Lovely. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Was there ever a time that you faced in your life that you had rejection or discouragement as well in your music career? And how did you push through it?
Yeah, well, I mean, that kind of happens no matter what level you are as an artist. Um, I think there's a general mistaken idea from people outside the faith that, Jesus somehow is going to take all our problems away and make everything that we do successful. And that's just not true. And that's not true biblically either. The most devout followers of Jesus, the apostles, they all lived pretty rough lives after they went out to the rest of the world, and most of them, were martyred for their faith. So I just understand and recognize that suffering is a part of life. It's a part of how we grow in our faith. It can be a way where God gets our attention, even if He's not actually the one who's causing it. And so as an artist, I just recognize it as part of doing my job.
You've been involved in music for so many years now. How would you explain that journey to the young self, you as a child, when you were looking at the beginning to get into the music industry, to where you are today? How would you describe that whole journey?
Well, music making itself has changed a lot in the 40 years that I've been making music. Lyric writing is still kind of the same process. I keep a notebook. I keep track of ideas that hit me. I'm always, being inspired by scripture or poets or things that are happening. And weirdly enough, for those of us that are Christians, Christian music is probably the only genre of music where it's defined by the lyrics, not by the music itself.
How important is it that we have Christian music around to inspire people today who don't know Jesus Christ, and how can we use that to reach those people as well?
Yes, I think it requires two types of music. Music made for the church. Every Sunday morning at the church that I go to, we sing beautiful modern worship songs that are still inspiring, as well as, a mix of some hymns that have been around for a long time. And we need those songs to help us enter into praise. But we also need artists that are fellow Christians that are living their lives out in the public, and also maybe writing songs about all kinds of different things, but getting their inspiration from the same place.
Now, you moved from a very successful music career to filmmaking, which is quite a big leap. What inspired you to make that transition?
Yeah, I was a film minor in college, so I always knew I wanted to get involved in filmmaking. But I thought it'd probably be better to have a band in my 20s and be a filmmaker in my 50s than the reverse. Always thinking ahead, And so that was sort of the plan. And I got the opportunity to make the shift at the early turn of the millennium. And so the first movie that I made was actually not a true story, but it was based on an idea of, we used to call them black and white buddy movies. And in this case, the white guy was the associate pastor at a big mega church in Nashville, where I live. And he was played by the Christian singer Michael W. Smith. And then the black guy was the pastor of an urban church that is supported by this big mega church. And in those types of movies, the two guys can't get along, right? Otherwise, you don't have a movie. So the white guy gets sent to work at the black guy's church, and the black guy doesn't want him there. And then over the course of the film, they figure out how to get along and how to both serve their community together. It was called The Second Chance. It was a good experience. It was a good movie. It's actually how I met Seth Worley, who is the writer-director of Sketch. So yeah, it was a good experience. And then Blue Like Jazz is inspired by a memoir by Donald Miller, but it was really similar to the experience that I'd had as a Christian growing up in a pretty conservative home, and then going to one of the most radical campuses in the U.S. And how do you reconcile those two worlds? And that was really the story of Blue Like Jazz as well.
Now, your new film is Sketch. It's being celebrated around the world at the moment. What drew you into this story?
Well, Seth Worley, the writer-director, is someone that I'd known for almost 20 years. I first met him when he was 19 years old, and his dad was a music pastor at this big mega church that we used as a location. And because his dad had done me such a huge favor, I said, "Hey, man, is there anything I can ever do for you?" And he said, "Well, could you look at my son's DVD?" And I'm thinking, okay, a 19-year-old kid who's made short films, sure, I'll look at it.
Yeah.
I had very low expectations, and it turned out they were fantastic. Wow. So I ended up hiring Seth to do second unit on the next two movies that I made, and then he'd hire me to act in some of his short films, and we collaborated on some promos and a music video. And so when it came time to make Sketch, he had gone out to Los Angeles to try to get it made at a studio for, tens of millions of dollars, and nobody was interested. So he moved back to Nashville, discouraged, and I met with him before I went to Taiwan to work on another movie and asked what's going on with Sketch. And he said, "It's dead. Nobody wants to make it." I said, "Man, come on, it's too good." He said, "No, nobody cares." So I said, "Well, give me the script." And I read it when I was in Taiwan. And when I got back, I said, "We can make this movie, but we just got to use our resources here in Nashville and be scrappy about it. And, we'll make it for a fraction of that price, but we can still make it great." And because Tony Hale was still involved and Seth is really good with visual effects, and we had a community of filmmakers and crew here in Nashville, we were able to pull it off for a fraction of the price and make it look like something that belongs on the big screen. And so we couldn't be happier with the way the movie turned out.
What an amazing story. So for anyone who's never seen Sketch before, how would you explain Sketch in your own words?
Yes. Well, we call it a mix between Inside Out and Jurassic Park. And that's actually a pretty good description. It's a really beautiful story, and it's really emotionally fulfilling. And it deals with, on some level, grief, because when the movie starts, we find out that 10-year-old Amber and her 12-year-old brother, Jack, that they've lost their mother. And Tony Hale, who plays their father and who's a fantastic actor and a fellow Christian, he is trying to figure out, what to do. And he thinks the best way to deal with this is to just not talk about it. But Amber has to work out these feelings. And so she goes to a counselor, and the counselor finds out she likes to draw. And the counselor gives her a sketchbook and says, "I want you to put all your feelings into this sketchbook." And so Amber just starts drawing what she's feeling because she is so grief-stricken. She just starts drawing these funny, comically horrific monsters. And then, of course, the monsters come to life and start terrorizing everybody in family film kind of ways. It's a really fun movie. I think it's a great movie for families to see. It's a little scary, but at a certain age, I'm thinking probably 8, 9, 10 plus. It's probably not great for 5 or 6-year-olds, but you kind of want to introduce scary things to kids because the world is scary. And there are parents that think, they want to be snowplow parents where they want to get rid of all the obstacles that their kids are going to encounter, but that doesn't help the kids, right? So you try to introduce these things at the right time. And I think Sketch is a good movie for families to see and to talk about afterwards. And it's just a really beautiful movie that I hope people enjoy.
What do you hope audiences can take away from this film Sketch?
Well, grief is something that is hard to talk about, and it's hard to talk about with kids as well. And all of us who have lived any life at all, we know how hard grief can be. But we especially can't imagine what it would like to have to grieve as kids. Unless you went through a real traumatic experience, most kids don't experience grief until they've lived a little while. Yeah. That's one reason why a lot of people think pets are a good thing, is because, a kid gets a pet, the pet dies, and they're kind of being introduced to what grief is. But when Amber and Jack, when they lose their mother, they're at a point where that's a really traumatic thing to experience. And so how do you deal with that as a father? How do you deal with that that trauma that your kids are facing? And Tony's character is just doing the best he can. He thinks the best thing to do is to not talk about it. So I think it's a really good opportunity to have a great, really genuinely funny and thrilling family experience, and then talk a little bit about what happens and what happens when you die, and what is our hope as Christians as well, and why is it that we don't need to fear death.
Is there any parts from the sketch film that actually came from a real life experience that you had?
So Seth, the writer-director, actually had a sibling who got in trouble for drawing an inappropriate drawing that had his teacher being shot full of arrows. And so he got called into the principal's office, and then the principal sent to a counselor, and the counselor said, is that really what you wanted to happen? And the response was, well, I don't now, but I did then. And the counselor said, well, I think it's a good thing then that you drew that instead of actually acting on those impulses. And Seth, even as a kid, thought, wow, that's a pretty smart response. And so that's kind of how the movie gets set out is Amber has drawn a picture of the person who's bullying her, who's a kid a year younger, kind of mean. And the counselor says, is that really what you wanted to happen to Bowman? And she says, yeah. And the counselor says, well, then I think you did the right thing, because it's much better to put something like that on a drawing where it can't hurt anybody than to act on it. And that sort of sets the story in motion.
Why do you think it's important that we have more films like Sketch in the world, especially of everything that people are going through in today's society?
Yes. Great question. I think there's a lot of kids' entertainment that's just kind of mindless, just feels more like it's there to babysit kids. What I love is the idea. I think this movie is the kind of movie that parents and kids should be watching together. And when families get together and experience something as a family and talk about it afterwards, I think it's just a great opportunity for a connection with your kids and watching something that's genuinely enjoyable. I think Sketch is one of those movies that's going to become a really beloved family classic for years to come. And I think it's going to have a long life because it's deeply emotional as well as genuinely funny and thrilling.
I love the fact that you're creating films to bring the family unit together for the parents and the children to watch something together, because in today's society, everything seems to be so separated. It's like the parents have their life and the children have a completely separate life.
Right.
In your opinion, what is your opinion of the society that children and families are living in?
Oh, man, there's so many studies coming out about kids having cell phones at too early of an age is messing them up, and how, they're having psychological issues because of social media and things like that. All these things that are turning kids into beings that are separate from not only their family, but from other friends, and living lives that are online. So getting everybody together as a family and watching something as a family and talking about it as a family is a way to help combat that, along with things like turning off the screens and eating together, family meals, and taking vacations together, and all the things that contribute to wholeness as a family, and which, frankly, I got to experience a lot of when I was growing up.
How does your faith continue to guide your creativity and your decision-making today?
Well, it's funny you should ask that. We just right before this, my wife and I had our morning devotions where we're reading through the entire Bible in 2 years. Our church decided we're all going to do this together, and so we started. And it's a portion of the Old Testament, a portion of the New Testament, and then a portion of Psalms. And I think when Scripture is just part of your everyday experience, it can't help but impact the way you think, the way you act in the world. It's just there. And Seth and Tony and I, because we're all fellow Christians and we all, grew up with a strong faith, when we come together and make something creative, it can't help but influence the types of things we make, because that's the world that we're inhabiting. That's the soup that we're in.
What advice would you give to a young person who may be watching today? They feel called to create, but they may be afraid to step out, or maybe they're afraid to fail. What would you say to them? In
my experience, that intersection between creativity and my Christian faith is a great place to live. And one of the reasons is because we recognize that art isn't ultimately only about self-expression. It's about serving others and about creating things that can actually be helpful to others. And it gives the creative process a whole different perspective. we've lived through a long era where artists are looked at as sort of entities unto themselves, and whatever they think and whatever they feel, they should just go for it, and they should live any way they want to, that's all part of it. And I just don't think that's a good way to live. But when you're creating in service to a higher calling, it just changes the whole perspective of why you do it.
To give us some inspiration to our viewers who are watching today, can you give us any examples of obstacles you experienced in your own life and how you were able to overcome them?
Well, so many. I'm not even sure where to start. But oftentimes it's just a lack of resources. Making records was expensive. Making music was expensive back in the day. It's not particularly expensive anymore. But making movies, when I shifted to that you added a couple of zeros to the budget. And so that's always a tricky one. Thankfully, because of the success I had in making music, I was able to use those resources to help me get bigger projects made. But that's always one of them. And then the other one is just, Cyrus, it's easy to turn artistic pursuits into idols. That a favorite pastor of mine, Tim Keller in New York City, who died a few years ago, but he talked about our hearts as being like idol manufacturing machines. And we so quickly take things that are good in themselves and turn them into ultimate things. Wow. And I found that the harder a project is to get made, the easier it is for me to start thinking that this has to happen, and that, my life won't be fulfilled unless I can get this made, and it becomes an ultimate thing. And so I'm constantly having to repent of that attitude and realize that, my ultimate hope and is in Jesus, and everything else can be a fun pursuit, but it's not ultimately as important as my standing before God.
Fantastic way to end this interview. A huge thank you. Steve Taylor, filmmaker, recording artist and creative visionary. Thank you so much indeed for joining us, and God bless you, brother.
Thank you, Cyrus.